So we brought you down to this end because we wanted to not cause trouble for the cafe. But you saw as we came out here that there were gates like this along the east side of the sculpture court. What many people don't realize is there was another set exactly like that across this end when the building was built in 1966. And they were taken down only when we expanded into the sculpture garden, and they felt there was no longer a need to have this locked off. But originally, the gates were on both sides. The history of Malcolm Leland is an interesting one. He was born in Pasadena in 1922, and he studied painting at the Yale School of Fine Arts. Then he came back west, and he studied at the Jepson Institute of Arts, which is not a really commonly, I think, identified art school, but it was kind of a modernist avant-garde sort of art school, and it was located in LA, and then he went on and studied further at USC. Now, interestingly, he started with painting, but he sort of merged over into ceramics, and he became a kind of a potter, specializing in making ceramic forms. And when he finished his education, he went on to work commercially in designing tableware, vases, that sort of thing in the field of ceramics. But according to an interview he gave a number of years ago, he said that because of imports from Asia, the market for American-designed pottery really fell apart, and so there was economic pressure that prevented him from really pursuing his career in that field. And he really felt maybe he had a new opportunity to move into a new field. Now, at the time he was making this switch, or contemplating this switch, there was this very interesting project going on in Brazil, designed by an architect named Oscar Niemeyer. It was this brand new capital city built out in the wilderness called Brasilia. And it involved a lot of architecture that had sort of sculptural forms on it, and he was very inspired by that. And so he decided, well, why can't I do that sort of thing using the talents that he devised as a sort of a sculptor potter. And so he approached the designer of a large project in Los Angeles, another very sort of modernist office building. It was called the Los Angeles County Hall of Records. It was a very big project that involved two large wings, one 13 stories and one 8 stories. And he approached the architect, Richard Neutra, a very iconic modern architect. And he pitched the idea that he could provide sort of decorative elements on the outside, but not in the sense of decorative architectural ornament that was historic, like, you know, Gothic or classical or whatever, but rather something that was very modernist. And he drew up some ideas, and the architect really liked it very much. So he hired him to design sort of these screens to hang over windows in one wing of that Hall of Records. And what he did for that one was he created ceramic panels that were modular and could be repeated over and over. To do that, he had to work with an old terracotta factory that had a long tradition of making these sort of clay ornaments for buildings, more in the tradition, though, of Louis Sullivan and the Chicago School, where you have this very decorative, kind of almost fussy ornament around windows and above doors and maybe on pilasters and stuff like that. But he basically reinvigorated that factory and got them to produce these very modernist shapes. They're sort of sunscreens that were hung over the windows, and they had a very sort of organic, free-form, wonderful design. So that was in 1957, and that really was his first collaboration on an architectural project. He went on from there to really build a career for himself. He designed or participated in over 30 architectural projects in the main part of his career, mostly up and down the coast of California. He did San Diego work, he did Los Angeles, the Valley, Oakland, and even went across the border and did something in Reno, but mostly pretty much West Coast work. So the design for this particular wing began in 1958 with the architects Mosher and Drew, as I said, but it was through a chance meeting between Roy Drew and Malcolm Leland, and his knowledge, in fact, of the LA County Hall of Records, that led him to propose that the head architect, Robert Mosher, should approach Malcolm Leland and ask him to help design some of the sort of decorative elements on this wing. Well, that led to a very good partnership, and so starting in about 1963, Leland began working on this building. And he really contributed 3 elements. The first of them, of course, are these gates, which involve this anodized cast aluminum in a sort of organic, it looks sort of like maybe vines intertwining or some sort of foliage. And he contributed that element first. And then also, if you look behind you up on the very top, he designed the fascia, which is, again, cast aluminum. They're comprised of these little sort of arched forms that have a kind of a shell, a very stylized shell or foliated element in each arch. Now, the challenge for building this west wing, and we have unfortunately not been able to talk to Malcolm Leland about it, but we did talk to the architect, Robert Mosher. We had 2 very extensive oral history interviews with him where he talked about these design challenges. And one of them was that he had to keep a sort of a stylistic tie to the original building, which was built in 1926 in the sort of Spanish style, but yet build in a more modern style, partially for cost reasons. To build this wing in that Spanish style from the original 1926 building would have cost 3 or 4 times what it cost to build this building. And we had a very, very small budget for this. Just to give an example, if you look across the way at the Timken Museum of Art with its marble and glass and steel, they budgeted $110 a square foot for that building. This building was budgeted at $30 a square foot. And so he wasn't able to provide a lot of the historicist kind of detailing, and he had to look for more reasonable materials. And so that's why we have sandblasted concrete rather than travertine. That's why we have cast aluminum rather than real bronze. And so he tried to find something that would give a style and a flair and an identity of its own to this wing, and yet not cost a fortune. So that accounts for the gates and, of course, the frieze, but also he was having trouble, Mosher, when I say he, it was Bob Mosher, was having trouble coming up with a distinctive column. And you can see that this whole courtyard is surrounded by these columns, as is, of course, the east front. And he had come up with several different designs and was not happy with them. So he turned those over to Malcolm Leland and said, see what you can do with these. So Malcolm Leland came up with this very distinctive sort of profile and shape with a kind of a hinted capital at the very top. They're sort of vaguely Moorish, which ties in with the kind of overall Spanish theme. And yet you can't pin them down and say, oh, these are from this building or from this time period or this location. They all sort of work through allusion to a Spanish style in Spain that we call Moorish under the Muslim influence. And so to cast these, they're all cast concrete, they actually had to invent a new casting process and go out to a concrete casting firm and actually had to do all sorts of testing to make sure they would bear the load they were intended to carry. So they made a whole series of tests and had to, load all kinds of weight on top to see what the breaking point was and make sure that they were structurally sound. And then so each of the columns was cast off-site, hauled here to the building, and then erected to hold up the main part of the structure. Now, what's kind of interesting about this was the original design was this was all going to be skylights. And when they built it, see where the lights are above your head, that white glass around there actually was open to the sky, and so you could have light coming through naturally. And so I think in the original design, there was a much more sculptural feeling to this whole courtyard because you would have the light coming in and you'd have the play of light and shadow on all of these columns. Even at that point, we didn't have the canopy over here either. It was open air in the courtyard. So one of the great items of the building that's really, I think, garnered some praise when it opened was in fact this sort of sculptural play of light and shadow over the forms that Malcolm Leland helped Bob Mosher and his partner Roy Drew provide to the building. The other element I can't credit to Malcolm Leland, of course, was the reflecting pool. And that was put here, of course, by Mosher and Drew. But it was an essential part of their design of this courtyard. It originally had jets of water shooting up. So again, it was a kind of a playful, sort of not static, but rather a dynamic element that was added to the courtyard. And it's interesting that they did that because I think later in his career, Malcolm Leland became very, very interested in water features. And in fact, he kind of segued from his architectural designs into more fountain design or water element design connected into an architectural framework. His other projects in San Diego that you may have seen or might want to go see if you're interested in learning more about Malcolm Leland include the JCPenney store over in Fashion Valley, which, if you remember it, has a kind of a sculptural panel on one or two of the facades that he had molded out of copper sheets. And when it was originally installed, it was meant to oxidize and get that turquoise patina that you often get with copper. And it had water, and so it was kind of one of those trickling fountains that runs down the face of these very sort of faceted rectangular elements that are sort of recessed and projecting out. But over time, it, I guess, proved to be a maintenance problem. So they stopped the water running, and then later on, they painted the whole thing over. So it is only a shadow of its former self. It used to be quite beautiful when it was copper. That was done in 1969. Another element you might see here in San Diego that you'd be interested about with Malcolm Leland is the great fountain down at the Civic Center concourse. It's called Bow Wave, and it looks like the prow of a ship, you know, slicing through water. There are jets of water along the two sides, and they shoot up, making it look like the splash of water as the ship powers through the water. That was created in bronze. It was very controversial work. He had a lot of resistance from the city. That was done in 1972. There were a lot of people who didn't feel it belonged there, that it was going to be a maintenance problem, but it's turned out to be one of the most popular public water features in San Diego. And he very cleverly designed the whole thing so that inside the structure would be the pumps that circulate the water and make the jets spray up. And so I always kind of harbored the idea that maybe he got the idea of the jets of water from here. I don't know if that's true. But he's built these kinds of fountains at various places. He's designed things for Caltech, UCLA, Occidental College. He's designed for many different bank buildings, sort of large commercial office buildings, and other places like that. So he's really had quite a distinguished career. He's now 91 years old. After working in LA for much of his career, he, in the 90s, established a studio where he could do his pottery in Potrero. He sort of liked that kind of isolated locale. I think over the years he developed a kind of a nice relationship with Jim Hubble, many of whose ideals I think they sort of share in common. But as his health has declined, he moved into a retirement home in Scottsdale, Arizona, where he's lived since 2007, I believe. And his health is failing, and we have kept in touch with the architect of the West Wing, Bob Mosher, who apparently talks to him a few times a year, maybe 3 or 4 times a year. And it's a kind of an interesting element of the building that we have this wonderful sculptor who is able to provide us with these very unique decorative ornaments on what is otherwise, I think, a fairly austere wing that was added to the building. That's all my prepared remarks. Do you have any questions? No? Sorry. Well,
Jim, where are the old gates?
the old gates are in storage, and
We still have them.
Yeah, they didn't discard them. We've had a couple of proposals of where they might be incorporated into other buildings, but so far no one's taken us up on that. We were talking about the Bread and Salt Annex, maybe incorporating some of the gates over there. Just a sort of a side note, the gates at the east end have been moved 3 times by different administrations of the museum, mostly because at one point they decided, well, the box office should actually be outside the gates so that we could have people buying tickets to events. And then someone else decided, no, that doesn't work. We're going to move the gates out and put the box office inside. So they moved them 3 times. And shh, don't tell anyone. The last time they moved them, they turned them around by accident and installed them backwards. So if you look at the gates on the east end, see how the column is on the inside of the gates here? It's supposed to be on the inside, but on the outside, on that side, they did it by accident. So we're going to keep that a secret among ourselves. Well, yes?
When did the white glass
Get covered?
Canopy, and what are your thoughts on that?
They had some maintenance problems because what was happening was the seals around the glass were wearing out very quickly, and they kept getting leaks through it. So, our landlord is the city of San Diego. We don't have a lot of say on the exterior of the building and what's done to it. The same skylights, by the way, are on the roof of the library. And so originally we had natural light coming into the library. And so there was a kind of concerted decision that the maintenance was a problem and that they would simply cover them. So what they did was put sheet metal covers over them. And I don't know the exact date, but I think it was in the probably the 80s that was done. So I think I agree with the decision in the library because you don't want a bunch of light coming in, fading your books. It was causing temperatures to go up, so the air conditioning costs were greater. But in this outdoor area, I think it's a loss because that natural light would have been, I think, really great. So it's all a matter of cost of maintenance. Well, thank you all for your attention.